In the heart of London, on a chilly autumn morning, the city buzzed with its usual energy. The streets were alive with the sounds of footsteps, distant chatter, and the occasional honk of a car horn. But near Buckingham Palace, there was an unusual calm. The grandeur of the palace stood in stark contrast to the quiet square where people gathered to take photos or simply admire the iconic building. Among the crowd stood an elderly man named Henry. His presence was hard to miss. Though his steps were slow and supported by a cane, there was something about him that commanded attention. He wore an old military jacket, faded from years of wear, but still carrying the weight of history. Rows of medals gleamed faintly on his chest, each one telling a story of battles fought and sacrifices made. His face was lined with age, but his eyes held a deep intensity, as if they had seen too much yet refused to look away. Henry wasn't there as a tourist. He had come for a different reason, though no one around him knew what it was. Nearby, a young royal guard stood tall and motionless, his red tunic and bearskin hat making him a striking figure against the gray sky. Tourists snapped pictures of him, marveling at his discipline. Children giggled as they tried to make him crack a smile, but he remained steadfast, a living statue bound by tradition. As Henry approached the guard, the noise around them seemed to fade. The clicking of cameras and murmurs of conversation softened, replaced by an unspoken tension. People noticed the veteran's deliberate movements. His cane tapped lightly against the cobblestones, marking each step like a heartbeat. When he finally stopped in front of the guard, he paused for a moment, gathering himself. Then, with trembling hands, Henry raised his right hand in a salute. It was not just any salute. It was a gesture filled with respect, gratitude, and memories of comrades who would never return home. The crowd fell silent, sensing that this was more than a simple act. Some watched curiously, while others felt a lump rise in their throats, unsure why but deeply moved. The guard, whose name was Corporal James Whittaker, did not move. By rule, he could not acknowledge anyone, not even someone like Henry. Yet beneath his stoic exterior, James felt a pang of emotion. He recognized the significance of the man before him. Stories of wars past, of soldiers who endured unimaginable hardships, echoed in his mind. Henry held his salute longer than expected, his gaze steady and unwavering. Time seemed to stretch as the moment hung in the air. The tourists, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, exchanged glances. Some whispered among themselves, wondering what would happen next. Others simply stared, holding their breath. When it became clear that the guard would not respond, disappointment flickered across Henry's face. Slowly, he lowered his hand, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of unspoken emotions. He muttered something under his breath, barely audible, but those closest to him caught the words, "They've forgotten us." With that, Henry turned and began to walk away, leaving behind a crowd frozen in contemplation. What had just happened? Why hadn't the guard responded? These questions lingered in the air, setting the stage for what would soon become an unforgettable encounter, a moment that would challenge traditions, stir hearts, and remind everyone of the true cost of freedom. As Henry turned away, the silence in the square grew heavier. The tourists who had been snapping pictures and chatting moments earlier now stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged worried glances. The royal guard, Corporal James Whittaker, remained as still as a statue, his face expressionless, but his mind racing. Beneath his towering bearskin hat, James felt a storm of emotions brewing. He had trained for years to maintain this unyielding stance, no matter what happened around him. It was part of his duty, a symbol of discipline and respect for the institution he represented. But today, standing before him was not just another passerby. This was a man who had lived through wars that most people only read about in history books. A man who had risked everything so that others could live in peace. James's eyes flickered slightly, though no one would notice unless they were watching closely. His gaze followed Henry as the elderly veteran walked away, leaning on his cane with each heavy step. Every tap of the cane against the cobblestones seemed to echo louder than it should, like a heartbeat slowing down. James wanted to move, to break rank and acknowledge the man, but he couldn't. Tradition bound him tightly, like invisible chains holding him in place. The crowd began to whisper among themselves. Why didn't he salute back? One woman asked softly, her voice tinged with confusion. Another man nearby replied, "It's protocol. He's not allowed to respond." But even as they spoke, their words lacked conviction. Something about the scene felt wrong. Henry stopped after a few steps, his frail frame silhouetted against the grand backdrop of Buckingham Palace. For a moment, it seemed like he might keep walking, disappearing into the sea of tourists. Instead, he hesitated, his grip tightening on the cane. Then, slowly, he turned back toward the guard. His face was etched with frustration and sadness, emotions too raw to hide. "Do you know what we gave up?" he called out, his voice cracking under the weight of decades-old pain. "Do you know how many didn't come home?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. Tourists stopped mid-step, cameras lowering from their faces. Parents pulled their children closer, unsure how to explain the tension unfolding before them. Even the pigeons scattered briefly, startled by the sudden intensity in Henry's tone. James heard every word, though he dared not flinch. Inside, however, his heart ached. He thought of his own training, of the stories veterans like Henry had shared during lectures at the academy. Men and women who had charged into battle knowing they might never see their families again, who had endured unimaginable horrors so that future generations could stand where he stood now, safe, protected, free. Tears welled up in James's eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. Crying was not permitted. Showing emotion was a breach of protocol. Yet, try as he might, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing, not just himself, but the very ideals he had sworn to uphold. The longer he stood there, unmoving, the more the weight of his position pressed down on him. Henry's words echoed in his mind. "They've forgotten us." Forgotten. Was that true? Had society moved on so quickly that the sacrifices of men like Henry were reduced to faded medals and old photographs? James clenched his jaw, fighting back the urge to shout, to scream, to do anything that would break the suffocating silence. Around him, the crowd began to murmur again. Some defended the guard, saying he was only following orders. Others sided with Henry, arguing that rules were meant to be bent when humanity demanded it. The divide widened, reflecting a deeper struggle between tradition and compassion, duty and empathy. As the tension mounted, no one noticed the single tear that escaped James's eye, sliding silently down his cheek. It disappeared into the fabric of his uniform before anyone could see it. But it was there, a small, quiet rebellion against the rigid walls of protocol. And though no one knew it yet, that tear would soon become the catalyst for something extraordinary. Henry's voice cracked as he spoke, his words sharp and heavy with emotion. "Do you know what we gave up?" he demanded, his tone rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "Do you know how many didn't come home?" His frail body trembled slightly, but there was no mistaking the fire in his eyes. It was as if decades of bottled-up feelings, anger, grief, pride, were spilling out all at once. The tourists closest to him shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or step back. Parents exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to explain this moment to their children. Some people lowered their cameras, realizing that what was happening wasn't just a photo opportunity. It was real, raw, and deeply personal. Others whispered among themselves, debating whether Henry was right to challenge the guard, or if he was crossing some invisible line. For Corporal James Whittaker, standing rigidly in his ceremonial uniform, every word felt like a punch to the gut. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink without breaking protocol. But inside, his mind raced. The stories he'd heard during his training, the tales of soldiers who had fought in trenches, endured freezing winters, and faced unimaginable horrors, flashed before him. Men and women who had given everything so that others could live in peace. And here was one of them, standing right in front of him, pouring his heart out. Yet James remained still, trapped by the very rules meant to honor tradition. Each second that passed felt like an eternity. The weight of Henry's question pressed down on him, heavier than his rifle, heavier than his bearskin hat. "Do you know how many didn't come home?" The phrase echoed in his mind, relentless and unyielding. Henry's frustration grew. Seeing no response from the guard, he took a shaky step forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "You stand there," he said, pointing a trembling finger at James, all stiff and proud. "But do you even understand what it means? Do you know what it costs?" His voice broke on the last word, and for a moment, the entire square seemed to hold its breath. Even the distant hum of traffic faded into the background. Everyone was watching now, captivated by the unfolding drama. Some people nodded in agreement with Henry, while others looked away, unable to meet his gaze. A few wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the raw honesty of his words. James wanted desperately to respond, to tell Henry that yes, he did know, or at least, he tried to understand, that he respected the sacrifices made by men like him more than words could express. But he couldn't. Not here. Not now. His training screamed at him to stay silent, to remain immovable, no matter what. Tears welled up in his eyes again, and this time, he didn't try to hide them. They blurred his vision, making the world around him seem distant and surreal. He clenched his jaw so tightly it hurt, willing himself to stay composed. Yet, deep down, he felt like he was failing, not just Henry, but everyone who had ever worn a uniform. Wasn't the point of being the soldier to protect and honor those who came before? How could he do that if he couldn't even acknowledge them when they stood right in front of him? The crowd began to react more visibly now. One man stepped closer to Henry, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sir, please," he said softly, trying to calm him. Another woman approached, offering a tissue. Henry accepted it with a nod, but didn't soften his stance. His eyes remained fixed on the guard, searching for something. A flicker of recognition, a sign of understanding, that never came. As the tension reached its peak, a child's voice cut through the air. "Why isn't the soldier talking to the old man?" The innocent question silenced the murmurs around them. All eyes turned to the boy, who looked genuinely confused. His mother knelt beside him, struggling to find the right words. "Well," she began hesitantly, "the guard has to follow rules. But sometimes, rules can be hard to understand." Her explanation hung in the air, incomplete and unsatisfying. The boy frowned, clearly unconvinced. Why would anyone choose rules over kindness? It was a question that lingered in everyone's minds, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, doing what's right isn't always easy or clear. Henry let out a long sigh, his shoulders sagging under the weight of exhaustion and emotion. For a moment, it seemed like he might walk away, leaving the scene behind. But then, something changed. His expression softened slightly, not with forgiveness, but with determination. If the guard couldn't respond, maybe someone else would. And with that thought, the tension in the square shifted once again, setting the stage for what would happen next. The boy's innocent question hung in the air like a fragile thread, connecting everyone present to a moment of uncomfortable truth. "Why isn't the soldier talking to the old man?" he asked again, louder this time, his voice tinged with confusion and curiosity. His mother knelt beside him, her face flushed as she realized all eyes were now on them. She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't shatter the innocence of childhood, but would also acknowledge the complexity of the situation. "Well," she began gently, brushing a strand of hair from her son's forehead. "The guard has rules he must follow. He can't talk or move while he's standing there. It's part of his job." Her explanation was simple, meant to soothe, but it only deepened the boy's frown. "But why?" he persisted, his small hands gripping the edge of her coat. If someone says something important, shouldn't you listen? Isn't that what people do? The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded almost imperceptibly, agreeing with the child's logic. Others looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The simplicity of his question stripped away the layers of justification and tradition, leaving behind a stark reality. Sometimes rules feel unnatural, even cruel, when they come at the cost of human connection. A middle-aged man nearby cleared his throat, stepping forward cautiously. "Son," he said, addressing the boy but glancing toward Henry and the guard. "Sometimes we have to follow rules because they keep things fair and orderly. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes those same rules make us forget what really matters, like saying thank you or showing respect." His comment sparked a ripple of murmurs among the onlookers. One woman chimed in, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not about fairness, though, is it? That man," she pointed toward Henry, "fought for our freedom. Shouldn't we honor him instead of hiding behind rules?" Her words ignited a debate, soft at first, but growing louder as more people joined in. A young couple argued that the guard was simply doing his duty, bound by centuries-old traditions that define the dignity of his role. An older gentleman countered passionately, saying that no tradition should outweigh gratitude, not when it came to veterans who had sacrificed so much. Meanwhile, Corporal James Whittaker stood frozen, feeling the weight of every word spoken around him. Though his body remained rigid, his mind raced with the conflicting voices. Was he upholding dignity, or was he perpetuating indifference? The boy's question echoed in his ears. Why isn't the soldier talking to the old man? It wasn't just a child's curiosity anymore. It was an accusation, a challenge to the very foundation of his training. Henry listened silently, his expression unreadable. His anger seemed to have softened into something quieter, but no less powerful: disappointment. He watched the crowd argue, their faces animated, their opinions divided. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if any of them truly understood what it felt like to be invisible, to give your life to a cause only to be met with silence in return. As the discussion grew heated, a teenage girl stepped forward, clutching a notebook and pen. She approached Henry tentatively, her voice shy but sincere. "Sir," she said, "may I write down your story? I want to remember, to tell others." Henry blinked, surprised by the request. For a moment, he studied her face, the earnestness in her eyes, the way she held her notebook tightly against her chest. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the chatter. "Write it down. Make sure they don't forget." The girl smiled faintly, jotting notes furiously as tears welled up in her eyes. Around her, the crowd began to quiet, drawn in by the sincerity of the exchange. Even the tourists who had initially been snapping photos out of idle curiosity now lowered their cameras, realizing that this moment was far bigger than a picturesque scene. It was a reckoning. As the tension simmered, another figure emerged, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a calm demeanor. She introduced herself as Margaret, a former nurse who had served during wartime. Her presence commanded attention, not through force, but through quiet authority. Stepping between Henry and the guard, she addressed the crowd, her voice steady and clear. "This isn't just about one man or one rule," she said, gesturing to both Henry and James. "It's about remembering who we are and where we come from. We owe these men and women everything, and today we need to find a way to show it." Her words struck a chord, silencing the remaining murmurs. Everyone turned to look at her, then back at Henry and the guard. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the next move would determine whether this moment ended in division or unity. And as Margaret took Henry's arm gently, guiding him closer to the guard, it became clear that the story. As Margaret guided Henry closer to the guard, the tension in the square reached a breaking point. Every eye was fixed on the trio, the elderly veteran leaning on his cane, the former nurse whose presence exuded quiet strength, and the young royal guard, standing as still as a statue but visibly trembling beneath his uniform. The crowd held its breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Corporal James Whittaker felt trapped between two worlds. On one side was the unyielding weight of tradition, demanding he remain motionless no matter what. On the other was the undeniable humanity of the moment, a man who had sacrificed so much standing before him, pleading for acknowledgement. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. He could feel the eyes of the crowd boring into him, their expectations heavy yet unclear. Should he break rank, or should he stay true to his duty? Margaret seemed to sense his internal struggle. She stopped a few feet away from the guard, her grip on Henry's arm firm but gentle. Turning slightly toward James, she spoke in a calm, measured voice that carried across the silent square. "Son," she said, her tone both kind and commanding, "I see your conflict. You're doing your job, and I respect that. But sometimes duty demands more than silence. It asks us to find a way, to honor those who paved the path we walk today." Her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone present. Some nodded in agreement, while others wiped tears from their eyes, moved by her wisdom. James swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to respond, to explain how torn he felt, but protocol forbade it. Instead, he stood there, his rifle resting against his shoulder, his body rigid but his resolve wavering. Henry looked up at Margaret, his expression softening slightly. For the first time since he'd approached the guard, some of the anger faded from his eyes, replaced by a flicker of hope. "Is this what it's come to?" he murmured, not angrily but sadly. "Do we have to beg for recognition now?" Margaret didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned back to James, her gaze steady. "You don't need to speak," she said firmly. "Sometimes actions say more than words ever could. If you can't step out of line, then show him. Show all of us that you hear him, that you see him." James's mind raced. What could he do? Tradition dictated that he remain immobile, but Margaret's words planted a seed of possibility in his mind. There had to be a way, a small gesture, subtle enough to avoid breaking protocol, but meaningful enough to bridge the gap between them. Slowly, an idea began to form. The crowd watched intently, their anticipation palpable. A young woman clutching her phone whispered to her companion, "What's going to happen?" Her friend shook her head, equally unsure. Nearby, the boy who had asked the initial question tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Will the soldier move?" he asked eagerly. She hesitated, unable to give him a clear answer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James made his decision. With painstaking slowness, he shifted his rifle from one shoulder to the other. It was a minor movement, barely noticeable to anyone unfamiliar with military customs, but it carried immense significance. To those who understood, it was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement that went beyond words. The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized what they were witnessing. Henry's eyes widened, and for a moment, he simply stared at the guard, disbelief etched onto his face. Then, slowly, a tear rolled down his cheek. He nodded once, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with emotion. Around them, the crowd erupted into spontaneous applause. Strangers hugged one another, united by the shared experience of witnessing something rare and profound. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for posterity, but no photograph could fully convey the depth of what had just transpired. For James, the act brought a mix of relief and guilt. Relief that he had found a way to acknowledge Henry without completely abandoning his post, and guilt that it had taken such effort to do so. As the cheers continued, he allowed himself a single blink, letting a tear escape unnoticed. It was a small rebellion against the rigidity of his role, but it meant everything. Margaret stepped back, satisfied. She glanced at Henry, then at James, and finally at the crowd. "This is how we remember," she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Not with statues or ceremonies alone, but with moments like these, moments that remind us of who we are and who we owe our gratitude to. As the applause began to fade, the square fell into a reflective quiet. The encounter had shifted something within everyone present, forcing them to confront questions about. The subtle shift of Corporal James Whittaker's rifle from one shoulder to the other seemed like a small act, but its impact rippled through the square like a quiet wave. Henry, still standing with Margaret by his side, felt the weight of the gesture. It wasn't a full salute or a verbal acknowledgement, but it was enough. A bridge stretched across the divide between tradition and humanity. For the first time since he had approached the guard, Henry's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though an invisible burden had been lifted. The applause from the crowd grew louder, echoing off the stone walls of Buckingham Palace. People clapped not just for Henry or James, but for the moment itself, a rare and fleeting collision of past and present, duty and emotion. Strangers embraced one another, some crying openly, others simply nodding in silent understanding. Even the pigeons that had scattered earlier now returned, pecking at crumbs on the cobblestones as if nothing unusual had happened, yet everything had changed. Margaret turned to Henry, her hand resting gently on his arm. "That was for you," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "He heard you, even if he couldn't say it." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "I didn't expect it," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But maybe it's enough." Nearby, the young boy who had sparked the debate tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Did the soldier move?" he asked eagerly, his wide eyes searching for confirmation. His mother smiled, crouching down to meet his gaze. "Yes, sweetheart, he did. He found a way to show respect without breaking the rules." The boy beamed, satisfied that the guard had done the right thing after all. As the cheers began to subside, Margaret stepped forward once more, raising her hand slightly to quiet the crowd. Her presence commanded attention, not because she demanded it, but because everyone wanted to hear what she would say next. She looked around at the sea of faces, young and old, locals and tourists, and spoke with a clarity that resonated deeply. "This isn't just about today," she began, her voice steady yet warm. "It's about remembering where we come from and honoring those who made it possible for us to stand here. These men," she gestured toward Henry, "and countless others gave their youth, their health, and sometimes their lives so we could live in peace. And while traditions are important, they should never overshadow the people they were meant to honor." Her words struck a chord, prompting murmurs of agreement throughout the crowd. A teenage girl clutching her notebook wiped tears from her cheeks, scribbling furiously to capture every word. An older man nearby nodded solemnly, muttering under his breath, "She's right. We can't forget." Meanwhile, Corporal James Whittaker remained motionless, though his mind was anything but still. The weight of what had just transpired pressed heavily on him. He replayed the moment over and over. The subtle shift of his rifle, the look in Henry's eyes, the eruption of applause. Had he done the right thing? Would his superiors see it as a breach of protocol, however minor? Or would they understand that some moments transcend rules? As if sensing his turmoil, Margaret glanced back at him, offering a faint smile of reassurance. Then, turning to the crowd, she added, "Let this be a reminder to all of us. Gratitude doesn't always fit neatly into rules or ceremonies. Sometimes it requires bending, just a little, to let someone know they're seen, that they matter." Her final words hung in the air, lingering long after she finished speaking. The crowd erupted into applause again, this time directed at Margaret, as much as Henry and James. People began to disperse slowly, some pausing to shake Henry's hand or thank him personally. Others lingered near the guard, snapping photos not out of curiosity, but out of respect. For Henry, the day had taken an unexpected turn. What had started as a personal mission to remind the world of forgotten sacrifices had become something far greater, a shared moment of connection and reflection. As Margaret helped him walk away from the square, he glanced back one last time at the guard. Though James remained frozen in place, There was no mistaking the gratitude in his eyes. And for James, the encounter left an indelible mark. The rigid lines of protocol suddenly felt less absolute, more malleable. He realized that being a royal guard wasn't just about standing still, it was about representing something larger than himself, something worth bending for. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light over the square, the scene began to fade back into normalcy. But for those who had witnessed it, the memory of what had happened would stay with them forever, a testament to the power of human connection and the enduring need to remember. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of the square, the crowd began to thin. Tourists gathered their belongings and moved on, some glancing back one last time at the royal guard who had dared to bend tradition. Parents ushered their children away, though many of the kids looked over their shoulders, still processing what they had witnessed. The moment was over, but its impact lingered in the air like the final notes of a powerful song. Henry leaned heavily on his cane as Margaret guided him toward a nearby bench. His steps were slower now, weighed down not just by age, but by the emotional toll of the day. He sank onto the bench with a sigh, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the medals on his jacket. "I didn't think it would go like this," he admitted quietly, his voice tinged with both relief and exhaustion. Margaret sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. "None of us did," she replied, smiling faintly. "But maybe that's the point. Sometimes life surprises us when we least expect it." She paused, glancing back at the guard who still stood motionless, his figure illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. "What matters is that you were heard, Henry. That's something." Across the square, Corporal James Whittaker remained rooted to his spot, his body rigid but his mind racing. The weight of the day pressed down on him, not just the physical strain of standing for hours, but the emotional burden of what had transpired. He replayed every detail in his mind. The tremor in Henry's voice, the applause of the crowd, Margaret's wise words. And then there was the rifle shift, the small act that had spoken volumes. It hadn't been much, but it had been enough to bridge the gap between them. For the first time since the encounter began, James allowed himself to fully feel the gravity of the moment. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes again, but this time, he didn't fight them. A single tear slid down his cheek, catching the golden light before disappearing into the fabric of his uniform. No one noticed. It was a private moment, hidden beneath the stoic exterior he was required to maintain. Yet inside, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. For Henry, for Margaret, and for the reminder that even within the confines of duty, humanity could find a way to shine through. The tourists who lingered nearby began to approach Henry cautiously, their faces filled with admiration and curiosity. A young couple stopped in front of him, the woman holding out her hand. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice breaking slightly. "For everything." Her partner nodded, adding, "We won't forget." Henry managed a weak smile, nodding in acknowledgement. Each word of thanks seemed to lift a little more of the weight from his shoulders. A teenage boy handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing he had sketched quickly, depicting Henry saluting the guard. "This is amazing," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Even the girl with the notebook returned, her pages now filled with scribbles and sketches. "Can I keep writing about you?" she asked shyly. "I want people to know your story." Henry hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said firmly. "Tell them. Make sure they remember." As the interactions continued, Margaret watched silently, her heart swelling with pride. She knew that moments like these were rare, when strangers came together to honor someone who had given so much. But she also knew that such moments couldn't exist without vulnerability. Henry had opened himself up, exposing decades of pain and pride. And in doing so, he had sparked something extraordinary. Meanwhile, the crowd's attention occasionally drifted back to James. Some offered him nods of respect. Others whispered words of encouragement as they passed. One elderly man stopped briefly, placing a hand on the barrier near the guard. "You did good, son," he said gruffly before walking away. James wanted to respond, to thank him, but protocol kept him silent. Still, the words warmed him, reinforcing the idea that he had made the right choice. As twilight settled over the square, the energy shifted once more. The initial intensity of the encounter gave way to a quieter kind of reflection. People lit candles they had brought or left flowers near the gates of Buckingham Palace, not for royalty, but for veterans like Henry. Others wrote messages on scraps of paper, tucking them into cracks in the stone walls as makeshift tributes. Henry noticed the growing collection of tokens and smiled faintly. "They haven't forgotten," he murmured to Margaret, his voice softer now. "Not completely." She squeezed his hand gently. "No, they haven't. And because of you, they'll remember a little better." The evening breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves, mingling with the fading sounds of footsteps and distant laughter. As Henry finally rose from the bench, leaning on Margaret's arm for support, he glanced back one last time at the guard. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting connection, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were different men, bound by different roles, but united by a shared purpose, to honor the sacrifices that had shaped the world they lived in. And as Henry walked away, disappearing into the gathering dusk, the square fell quiet once more, but the memory of what had happened there would remain, a testament to the enduring power of gratitude, connection, and remembrance. By the time night fell over London, the square outside Buckingham Palace had transformed. The golden light of sunset gave way to the soft glow of street lamps, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The crowd that had gathered earlier was gone, leaving behind only traces of their presence. Flowers laid at the palace gates, flickering candles arranged in makeshift memorials, and scraps of paper bearing handwritten messages. It was as if the day's events had left an invisible mark on the very air, a quiet reminder of what had transpired. News of the encounter spread quickly. By morning, headlines blared across newspapers and social media feeds. "War veterans salute Sparks' reflection at Buckingham Palace," "a moment that shook tradition," and "Guard's silent gesture moves nation." Journalists scrambled to piece together the story, interviewing witnesses who spoke passionately about the veteran, the Guard, and the emotional exchange that had unfolded. For many, it became more than just a news item. It was a conversation starter, a catalyst for deeper reflection on gratitude, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom. Corporal James Whittaker found himself at the center of the storm. His subtle rifle shift, though unnoticed by most people at first, became a symbol of humanity within discipline. Some praised him for finding a way to honor Henry without breaking protocol. Others criticized him, arguing that even minor deviations undermined the sanctity of tradition. But James didn't focus on the backlash or praise. Instead, he replayed the moment in his mind. The look in Henry's eyes when their gazes met, the applause of the crowd, Margaret's reassuring smile. He realized that while rules were important, they existed to serve something greater. The people those rules were meant to protect and honor. For Henry, the aftermath brought both peace and purpose. Strangers reached out to thank him, sharing stories of their own family members who had served. Schools invited him to speak, eager for students to hear firsthand about the sacrifices made during wartime. Though speaking publicly wasn't easy, it stirred up memories he had tried to bury. It also gave him a renewed sense of mission. "If I can remind even one person," he told Margaret during one of these visits, "then it's worth it." Margaret herself became a quiet advocate for veterans' recognition. She began organizing small gatherings where former service members could share their stories, ensuring that their voices wouldn't fade into history. Her efforts inspired others to join the cause, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond that autumn day in London. As weeks turned into months, the scene at Buckingham Palace remained etched in the collective memory of those who had witnessed it. Tour guides began pointing out the spot where Henry had stood, recounting the story to visitors from around the world. Even the royal guards stationed there felt its impact. Some admitted privately that they now carried a deeper awareness of the weight of their role, not just as symbols of tradition, but as representatives of a nation built on sacrifice. The encounter also sparked broader conversations about how society honors its veterans. Debates emerged about whether traditions should adapt to better acknowledge human connection. While opinions varied, one thing was clear. The image of an elderly man saluting a stoic guard, and the silent gesture that followed, had touched something universal. It reminded people that behind every rule, every ceremony, and every uniform were real lives shaped by courage and loss. One evening, months later, Henry returned to the square. This time, he came alone, leaning heavily on his cane as he navigated the familiar path. The flowers and candles were long gone, replaced by the usual bustle of tourists and locals. Yet as he approached the palace gates, he noticed something new. A plaque mounted discreetly nearby. Etched into the metal were simple words, "In honor of those who gave everything, so we could stand here today." Tears welled up in Henry's eyes as he read the inscription. He traced the letters with trembling fingers, feeling a mix of sorrow and gratitude. The plaque wasn't grand or flashy. It didn't need to be. It was a quiet acknowledgement, much like the rifle shift that had sparked this chain of events. And in that moment, Henry knew his message had been heard. As he turned to leave, a young royal guard standing nearby lowered his rifle slightly, meeting Henry's gaze. There was no salute, no words exchanged, just a nod of respect. Henry nodded back, a faint smile playing on his lips. Then, with slow but steady steps, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The square grew quiet again, the hum of daily life returning. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The encounter between a war veteran and a royal guard had become more than a fleeting moment. It was a legacy, a reminder that even in silence, we